Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Today I'm going to cover The Library of Ancient Wisdom by Selena Wisnom. The tagline for this book is Mesopotamia and the Making of the Modern World. This is from book 20 for my 2025 reading list. Well, this book is mainly about three things, and those are Cuneiform, Ashurbanipal, and the Library of Ashurbanipal. And there's this idea that comes up, or I started thinking about it a lot in this book, and it's this idea versus the flood versus fire. And when I think of a flood, I think of something that's kind of temporary, and there's a lot of damage, and we see rivers rise and it'll take out towns and people will die. It's all very tragic. But to me, fire seems like the worst calamity. Fire can just wipe out an entire area. Everything's gone. There's nothing remaining. And yet, when we're looking at the ancient flood, especially the flood, like capital letters, the deluge, the one in Genesis, the one in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's this idea of a flood that wipes out everything. And it's the ultimate dividing line between prehistory and history, as in nothing survived from before the flood. So if there were cuneiform tablets, the thing that can destroy a cuneiform tablet is a flood. So water will just destroy the clay tablet. And so anything that you had written on a clay tablet before the flood is wiped out. And you see this idea there even in Gilgamesh, there's this idea that Utnapishtim is someone that knew of things before the flood and had knowledge from before the flood. And yet here with fire, the Library of Ashurbanipal was burned down. And yet that fire was the very thing that preserved these cuneiform tablets. So the invading army comes in and they set this library on fire. Perhaps the roof caves in, and there's this like 2,500 year time capsule that is discovered, 2,300 years. It's opened up in a couple hundred years ago, and then all of a sudden we have access to these clay tablets, and the fire actually makes them stronger. So these clay tablets, instead of the fire ruining these clay tablets, they get stronger. And I'm so interested in these things, especially with the flood. Like just when I came across the deluge, the flood story in Gilgamesh, that was so interesting to me. The similarities, knowing that this was probably 1,000 years before the stories compiled in the Hebrew Bible, and just seeing similarities but seeing differences. I went down tons of rabbit trails in these things, but yeah, just to see in this book where fire actually preserved. But there still is this idea that I'll talk about in a little bit, where a flood kind of wipes out everything, and you can't access things that happened before that flood. So I mention all that just because the Library of Ashurbanipal, fire was so important to the safeguarding. We have 30,000 tablets from this library, but the fact that it did catch on fire is one of the reasons that we were able to have these clay tablets. So let's start with, of these three things, let's start with cuneiform. So cuneiform, like you've probably seen tablets, it almost looks like a bird has walked on them, just the way the imprints on these clay tablets. And obviously they're clay, they're of these tablets, so the clay dries and then it has this hard surface. And they have lasted incredibly long time. And so with different archaeology, we've been able to obtain some of these tablets, and then we learned how to decipher them and read them. But some main things to note about cuneiform is that it has just the longevity of it. So cuneiform started to be used around 3,400 BC. This would have been in the south of Mesopotamia, so the area of Babylon, and then the latest tablet went to 80 AD. So almost 3,500 total years of cuneiform being used as a writing system, and that's more than half of human history. You can think of cuneiform as symbols that can be used for multiple languages. So Sumerian and Akkadian are the two main languages that are discussed in this book, but there were others as well. And so it's kind of like our letters can be used for Spanish, Italian, English, but they're for the most part, the same letters. It's the same idea with cuneiform, where multiple languages can be used, but you have these different symbols. Knowledge of cuneiform came with great prestige. So there's this idea that wisdom was handed down from the gods, but being able to read these cuneiform tablets, that was the key to understanding the secrets of the universe, according to Selena Wisnom in this book. There were around 1,000 signs in cuneiform, but to get a general sense and to be able to read most of what was out there, you needed to know between 68 and 112 of those signs. What ended up replacing cuneiform was Aramaic, and then Aramaic began using letters instead of these signs with cuneiform. Aramaic is what Jesus spoke, so in the time frame we're looking at when cuneiform was strong, that would have been before that time, and then around by the time Jesus is around, they're speaking Aramaic at that point, and using more of the letters. So that's some info about cuneiform. Let's go to Ashurbanipal now. He was the king of Assyria, and Assyria is in the northern area of Mesopotamia. So again, Babylon is in the south, and then Assyria would be in the north. So Ashurbanipal, he ruled from 669 to 631 BC. And I want to read something that he said, and this is quite astonishing. So here's, let me read, and this at first here is Selena, the author, Wisnom, speaking. And then we get into a direct quote from Ashurbanipal. So it was usual for Assyrian kings to be literate, but Ashurbanipal boasts to have studied to the same level as his scholars, a claim made by no other Assyrian monarch. And so now we go into the quote here of Ashurbanipal himself. I learned the craft of the sage Adapa, the secret and hidden lore of all the scribal arts. I am able to recognize celestial and terrestrial omens and can discuss them in an assembly of scholars. I am capable of arguing with expert diviners about the series called If the Liver in a Mirror Image of the Heavens. I can resolve complex mathematical divisions and multiplications that do not have an easy solution. I have read cunningly written texts in obscure Sumerian and Akkadian that are difficult to interpret. I have carefully examined inscriptions on stone from before the deluge that are sealed, stopped up, and confused. I'll stop the quote there. I just love that. Like you just picture this guy in a bar just bragging like this, except he was the king of Assyria. But he was a scholar, and we even have some of his writings on these clay tablets. And he was known to have never gone anywhere without a pen, which is just awesome because he was a warrior poet, but just like a brutal man. Like just the stuff he would do to the people he conquered was just all, like, it's hard to read about, and yet he's got this like just killer library, and he's writing, he's up there debating his scholars, like he's a scholar himself. And there's this famous, I'll show it in the show notes, but there's this famous stone carving of Ashurbanipal, and he's battling this lion. He's got this spear in his hand, and you look in his belt, and there's a stylus, which like a pen. So to where he would have been able to do cuneiform. So just this like awesome dude going out and fighting, and then he's got this pen just at the ready, just in case he's got to write something down. So I thought that was so cool. But you know, in that thing I just read, that last part just always, I've come across this statement before, but that last part gets me. I've carefully examined inscriptions on stone from before the deluge that are sealed, stopped up, and confused. So at the beginning, when I was talking about flood versus fire and how flood would just wipe out everything, here he's claiming to have read things that were from before the deluge, and the reason is it seems like there is something that somehow these were sealed. So he says, I have carefully examined inscriptions on stone from before the deluge that are sealed, stopped up, and confused. So sealed and stopped up, I guess they were in some sort of a container where the flood did not get to them, and he was able to read these things. I don't know if we know what of those things or if they were marked in the library or anything of what he claims to have read that would have existed from before the deluge. I don't recall anything else in this book that describes those particular things, but what an idea. I mean, this is again, he's living 669 to 631 BC, slightly after Homer. This is before the Greek tragedy writers, and you've got a guy claiming to have read stuff from before the deluge, from before the flood. It's pretty cool. So we've gone through Cuneiform, Ashurbanipal. Now we get to Ashurbanipal's library, which is kind of a mix of these two things, of Cuneiform and Ashurbanipal. It's this ginormous library, and the purpose of this library was to safeguard knowledge. This was not something you got a Cuneiform library card and you just as an average citizen just kind of went in and perused the clay tablets here. This was not open to the public. This was a specific collection, a private collection for the king and his scholars. And I'll get into what types of books were in there later in this episode. But this library has been called a chamber of records, and the purpose was to safeguard knowledge. There were 30,000 tablets, and the way the author describes it is it's the world's largest jigsaw puzzle, because even though these tablets were burned in a fire and that solidified them more, they're just over time, there's cracks, there's corners missing, there's pieces that were collected from, and it was actually three different libraries in Nineveh that these things were collected. And they were collected at such a time that they didn't put a lot of purpose into describing which library they came from. So now we've got these pieces, these puzzle pieces in a way, where we're trying to fit them all together. And many of these tablets live now in the British Museum, and there's not many people out there alive who can read cuneiform. And so we've run into this issue of having all these tablets, but not having a whole lot of people who can read them. There's kind of this hope that AI can help with some of that of kind of initially scanning these tablets, doing a quick translation, and then giving the people who can read it then indication that, okay, this is an important one, or this is Gilgamesh, and here's another part of Gilgamesh, or a part that we're missing. So it's kind of fun in that sense. But I mean, what a time to be alive! Like, these were not discovered until 150, 200 years ago, and now people are reading them for the first time in thousands of years. So this library was in Nineveh, as I mentioned before. In Nineveh, we know that in the book of Jonah, and that I looked up that time frame, and they think that was probably during the reign of Ashurdan III, who ruled in Assyria from 773 to 755. So again, the time we're talking about now with Ashurbanipal is 669 to 631. The actual library was destroyed after Ashurbanipal's life, so it was destroyed in 612 BC. And let me read that part, because this is quite interesting here as well. So this gets into who all was involved in this destruction of the library. So here we go. By waging war on Babylon, Ashurbanipal sowed the seeds of Assyria's own destruction, deepening Babylon's resentment and creating the conditions for yet another uprising. 5 years after Ashurbanipal's death, an Assyrian general of Babylonian origin called Nabopolassar broke away and established himself as king of Babylon in 626 BC. In 614 BC, he teamed up with another rising power in the east, an Iranian people called the Medes, who invaded and took the Assyrian city of Ashur. Various other tribes who had been oppressed by the Assyrians for generations also joined forces with them, and they all converged upon Nineveh in 612 BC, burning Ashurbanipal's palace and library to the ground. The Neo-Babylonian dynasty inherited Assyria's empire, and the torch passed back south, again to the original cultural center of the Middle East. So I'll end the quote there. So what we have is the Babylonian people. They connect up with the Medes. They converge on Nineveh, 612 BC. They burn down Ashurbanipal's palace. Again, he has been dead for... he's been dead for almost 20 years at this point. They burned the palace. The library is also burned to the ground. Before they burn the library, they do take out some records. So it wasn't like they didn't know what was there and it just burned down and everything was still in there. But they think what they ransacked the library before it burned down. They think what was taken was more like updated records. So a lot of these tablets just had general bureaucratic information as well. So like what was going on in the kingdom. And so they think a lot of that might have been taken just so that the people attacking knew what was going on or knew kind of the latest of what was happening with the government. So, but what remains is, these 30,000 tablets. That's quite a bit going on. And what did remain was, content that basically fit into 5 different branches, as Dr. Wisnom notes in this book. And those 5 branches are astrology, exorcism, medicine, entrail, divination, and lamentation. And so I'm going to go into each of those in the next segment of this podcast. What's really cool is some of Ashurbanipal's own schoolwork survives. So he would, mark his name on it. And with a lot of these clay tablets that have survived, not necessarily in this library, but in other places, it would just be schoolwork. So you just imagine going to school and you're practicing your Cuneiform and you got to get it down. So you got to practice a lot. So you might copy out a section of Gilgamesh. You might copy out a section of a hymn or something else, and you're practicing the art of cuneiform. So when we chance upon these school rooms, there are just lines of these tablets, and you can see these kids kind of practicing. But the library of Ashurbanipal had some of his own work in there. Most of the literature that was in this library, if it was literature as opposed to like the other 5 branches that I was talking about, the stories would have been about the adventures of the gods and not necessarily of humans. And just at the beginning, a lot of the writing was used for bureaucracy. So it's not like they started writing Gilgamesh stories to start off with. It probably had more to do with accounting and, how much grain do I have that I'm selling you? And we got to have a record of this. And so that's kind of where the writing started, but then expanded out into literature and other things. What's really neat in this library is that there are a number of commentaries within the text. So you might have the cuneiform text, but then in the margin, there are commentaries about what is happening in the text or some additional information. So that's obviously very helpful to scholars now, just because we get a lot of insight into how they were viewing that text and looking at it. So this library was excavated between 1851 and 1932. So a little less than 200 years, but pretty close to that. As for the author, Selena Wisnom, she is at the University of Leicester. In the UK, she's a lecturer in the heritage of the Middle East. She's written 3 plays that are set in ancient Assyria. So I would love to see those. I think that'd be really, really cool. And at the very start of the book here, she writes out what the purpose of the book is. So let me read what she says about that, because I think that's quite interesting. This book will not repeat those stories. And before that, she's talking about how most books about Mesopotamia deal with kind of the grand sweep of history and the development of civilizations, the rise and fall of Mesopotamia's various states. So she says, this book will not repeat those stories, though it will cover them where necessary. Instead, it will illuminate Mesopotamian culture through the people who lived it, seeking to understand how they thought and putting their knowledge in its human context. Ashurbanipal's library is extraordinary in that it preserves the voices of the people who used it, as well as the knowledge itself, giving us a unique opportunity to see Assyria through Assyrian eyes. End quote. And I love that. Seeking to understand how they thought and putting their knowledge in its human context. She does a great job of that in this book, where she will even kind of give modern day examples of, we'll look back at this time and think, like, what were they thinking? Like, this is so weird. This is so foreign from how we do things, or, how we consider things. But then she'll give a modern day example of things that we do. And it's not that far different. And so it's just kind of funny to see how there are similarities, especially when you're looking at a people that were this long ago, 2,500 years ago. And you can just see like some really interesting connection points there. I've read a lot. So a lot of what I came across in this book, I've read in other things about Mesopotamia, just because I started reading the Immortal books in 2023. I started with Gilgamesh, and I just fell in love. I read a bunch of versions of Gilgamesh. Each version had different intro or essays, and then I got deep. I loved learning about Mesopotamia. I loved the works that were from that time period, and so I ended up reading a decent amount about that. And so I actually came across a lot of the information that I found in this book, but this book does such a good job of packaging it and just having it all in one place. And then it just goes deep into what, the purpose of this book is to talk about Ashurbanipal's library. So you go deep into that. But yeah, this would just be a great place to start if you're interested in Mesopotamia and you want to kind of find points where you could go deeper after this. This book was actually sent to me by the publisher, and it was sent to me last year or earlier this year maybe, but it's one that I probably would have purchased anyway, just because I'm deeply interested in Mesopotamia. I have seen part of Ashurbanipal's library in the British Museum. We get Gilgamesh from that. I love Gilgamesh. I've seen the Gilgamesh tablet that was from Ashurbanipal's library. And so I just have a deep interest in it. And this book is just kind of like, it just seems like it's calling my name. So I was very glad to read it. Quick stats for this book. It's 335 pages. I read it between July 4th and July 13th. So it took 10 days. In that time, I read it for 10 hours, 45 minutes, and 17 seconds. So that's 34 pages per day. I know that's nerdy to track that. I just am curious how long books take me to read, and I like sharing that because I read rather slowly. So that gives you a good indication of how long it might take you to read the book as well. So in the next segment, I want to go through 3 different things that stuck out to me. And then segment 3, the final segment, I'll cover the one thing that really blew me away in this book. All right, in this segment, I want to cover 3 different areas that I found to be fascinating. And the first is, I just want to talk about those 5 branches of knowledge. So these were most of the tablets they found fit within these 5 branches. And so I'll go through those. I'll go through, secondly, Gilgamesh, just some connection points with the Ashurbanipal's library and Gilgamesh. And then the third thing I want to talk about is the Old Testament and just how there were similarities, there were differences between what was found in Ashurbanipal's library and the Old Testament, but just how it kind of helps us understand some things about the Old Testament and vice versa. So let's start with the 5 branches. Again, those are astrology, exorcism, medicine, entrail, divination, divination, and lamentation. So if most of the books in the library were of these, and some of these are very weird to us, but she describes them and then gives examples of how they could be similar to how we think. So let's dig into these. The first is astrology. So the Assyrians believed that the gods communicated with the king through celestial portents, and so that's why astrology was so important. That it was almost like a communication method from the heavens, and so it would be important to know what was going on in the sky. The Assyrians were also very strong on mathematical astronomy. It was one of their greatest achievements, and it's the basis of our modern science. So it was neat to learn about that in this book. And the other aspect of astrology, and then maybe kind of more science in general, is just the longevity of the information and the things that were collected over time. And so let me read this part here. This is really interesting. Mapping the sky in these mathematically equal divisions meant that the astrologers could record their observations more precisely, observations from which they then set down in astronomical diaries. The earliest such diary surviving today dates from 652 BC, but the diaries most likely began much earlier. The Greek astronomer Ptolemy tells us that he used Babylonian records and that the earliest available to him were eclipse records from 747 BC. The last diary that we know of dates to the year 22 BC. This means at least 600 years worth of data going by primary evidence alone, 700 if we take Ptolemy at his word, making this the longest running scientific project in history. End quote. So you just think of that. So again, with cuneiform, they're on these tablets. There's just a natural longevity to these. I mean, I have some paperback books from 20 years ago, and the paper's already browning, and the book's falling apart. And yet here are these tablets, and these tablets are lasting for 700 years. Maybe they're being recopied as well, but there's a longevity to cuneiform, and there's a longevity that allows for data analysis. So you just think of kind of large models over time. Like when you have the reports of weather now where they're saying, this is the hottest day we've ever had since information's been collected, and the information's been collected for like 100 years. And here are the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians, and they've collected information for 600 or 700 years, and they've recorded it. And so now you can see how this would lead to being able to do like incredibly detailed scientific projects in the sense of what's going on in the skies. Like, can we begin to predict eclipses? Can we begin to predict where things are going to be and all that by just having all this data? And so I just love that idea, but again, it's brought about by the longevity of cuneiform and the longevity of cuneiform being used in this area. So the next thing we come to is exorcism. Exorcism is very weird to me. I just think of like crazy movies and that kind of thing. But here is how this was described, and I think this might be helpful. The gods could turn against you at any time without you knowing why. Demons could attack and witches could curse. But despite the capriciousness of the divine world, the Assyrians did not feel helpless, because they always had a chance to influence these powers and change the minds of those responsible. The exorcist could not guarantee that the gods would bestow their favor, but he could at least guarantee his client that they had done all they could to ask. The elaborate rituals would have been psychologically powerful, which is reassuring in itself. And I'll stop reading there. But it just kind of gives you a little idea of what exorcism looked like for them. And I thought just that comment that despite the capriciousness of the divine world, the Assyrians did not feel helpless because they always had a chance to influence those powers and change the minds of those responsible. And so that's part of what is going on there with exorcism. The next part, so astrology, exorcism, medicine, entrail, divination, and lamentation. So the third thing is medicine. This was a neat part of the book where she kind of compared exorcism to medicine. So let me read this part. As chief physician, Urad Nanya primarily dealt with the aspects of medicine that we would recognize most easily: dressing wounds and administering drugs, concentrating on the physical causes. The king's exorcist, on the other hand, addressed the metaphysical causes of disease, cleansing the patient from sin, spiritual impurities, demons, and witchcraft, and bringing him back into a state of harmony with the gods. Each specialist had their preferred treatments. The physicians prescribed pharmaceutical drugs, while the exorcist mainly used incantations. However, in practice, these responsibilities were not quite so neatly divided, as both exorcists and physicians were interested in each other's tactics. Exorcists kept tablet texts dealing with physical health care in their libraries, while Ashurbanipal's doctors were as likely to prescribe amulets and magical substances as medications and salves. And I'll stop reading there. But you kind of see how there's a little bit of overlap in exorcism and medicine, and how, she does a great job. They're just saying what each one was responsible for, but they're gonna kind of move into each other's area there as well. So the next thing is entrail divination, and again, this is one of those things that we have a hard time understanding. You cut up and open an animal, and then based on how their insides are presented, there's answers to things that are coming up. But again, here's kind of how she puts it, and I found this to be helpful. The answer to any extipacy, so that's the entrail divination, was always yes or no, which helped to distill nebulous discussions down to the essentials and enabled clear decision-making. And since the decision came sanctioned by the gods, it was held to be objective. No individual was responsible if the result did not turn out as expected. And I'll end the quote there. So you're cutting up the animal, you're seeing things inside. Part of the point is no human could have gone in and altered this. So when you cut open the animal, you're seeing things as perhaps the God is communicating to you. But just this aspect of the answer is always a yes or a no. So the documents or the tablets in the library would have told you how to interpret what you're seeing when you cut open the animal. And so, but it would be binary. It would be a yes or no. So it wouldn't be, oh gosh, what does this mean? What if it has this and this and this? But just it gave clear answers. So that was helpful to me, just kind of understand like what's going on here. The last thing is lamentation, and we're familiar with that if we've read parts of the Old Testament. There's a book called Lamentations. You read about all the battles and stuff going on at this time, and you figure lamentation must have been a pretty important part, just with all the chaos and war and all that going on. But let me read this part here about lamentation. One of the most important uses of Sumerian in the first millennium BC was, in fact, for this lamentation poetry, which is one of the largest genres of Sumerian texts in the library. However, laments were uttered and written in Akkadian too, and are among the most exquisite examples of the language. With their eloquent statements of the horrors of war, the laments could be used to criticize the very idea of armed conflict. End quote. So one thing really interesting there is that last part, that these laments could be used to criticize the very idea of armed conflict. It's kind of that the sense what you get when you're reading the Iliad of like, this is a war epic, and there's honor and there's glory, and you're reading all about like these impressive and honorable and glory seeking aspects of war, and yet there's also you read it and you're like, this is not glorifying war. If anything, it's almost giving you, it's showing you the negative side of war too. And it's brilliant just in that it's not all like let's all go to war, but there is both of those aspects. So same thing with lamentation. That was one aspect of it. The other thing that was interesting that came up with lamentation is that there would be professional people who were lamenting, and they would almost lament things in advance. And she talks about that in this book, and just kind of how we do some similar things, but yeah, lamentation is just so interesting to me. But a lot of the works in Ashurbanipal's library were dealing with lamentation. All right, next up is my favorite thing so far about Mesopotamia, and that is the Epic of Gilgamesh. So let's dig in a little bit to this. So in this book, we read a lot about Gilgamesh. Our most copies and the best preserved manuscripts of Gilgamesh come from the library of Ashurbanipal. So we would probably be missing some parts of the story were it not for the preservation of this library. And it is our best source of knowledge of the Epic of Gilgamesh, this library. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to read this book, is just how closely tied Gilgamesh is to the library of Ashurbanipal. In fact, there are more copies of Gilgamesh than any other piece of literature in the library of Ashurbanipal. I have to read this story. I think this is just the coolest thing. And so, stick with me here. That it's a paragraph and then a little bit more, but this is so cool in how it relates to Gilgamesh. 36 years before Ashurbanipal's reign, on a hot summer day at the end of the 8th century BC, bad news reaches the city of Kalu. King Sargon is dead. The chief scribe, Nabu, can hardly believe what he is hearing. The messenger sent ahead of the returning army is saying that not only has the king been killed in battle, a rare and unexpected thing in itself, but even worse, the enemy has seized the body and the Assyrians have not been able to wrest it back again. The implications of this are huge. In a state of shock, Nabu retreats to his study and takes down from the shelf Tablet 7 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. These lines are of such profound significance that Nabu copies the tablet and dates it the 27th of Duzu, 705 BC. Now I'm going to skip a page and continue reading. He, so this is Nabu, was consulting the poem as a source of philosophical knowledge, a reflection on what happened to the souls of the dead. Its warnings were taken seriously. Soon afterwards, the new capital city that the king had founded was abandoned in case Sargon's ghost came back to haunt it. The seat of governance was moved to Nineveh, where Nabu's tablets eventually ended up in the royal collection that formed the beginnings of Ashurbanipal's library. He signed and dated versions of Gilgamesh Tablet 7, or his signed and dated versions of Gilgamesh Tablet 7 was found among the library tablets when the hill was excavated in the 19th century AD. End quote. So let me just kind of go through here what happens. The king is killed in battle, not Ashurbanipal, but King Sargon, who was a king before him. And the chief scribe, Nabu, he finds out about it. What does he do to console himself? He takes off his copy of Tablet 7 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and this is where Gilgamesh and Enkidu are encountering the souls of different people and their fate in death. And so there's one that says, "Did you see the one who was killed in battle? I did. His mother and father honor him, and his wife weeps for him." There's one at the end though. "Did you see the one whose corpse lies in the steppe?" "I did. His ghost does not rest in the netherworld." "And did you see the one whose ghost has no one to provide for him?" "I did. He eats dregs from the pot and crumbs of bread discarded in the street." So that's from Gilgamesh, but it's saying, if the corpse just lies out in the open and is not buried, the ghost does not go to the netherworld. And then, so that's a big problem. They move the capital city just in case this guy comes back, Sargon comes back as a ghost. That's how seriously they took that thing. But what's amazing is Nabu, the scribe, relates the date that he read or copied this part out in response to the king being killed. And then we have that tablet now. Like, we found that tablet that he wrote when this actual historical event took place. I just think that is so amazing. The fact that the chief scribe went to the library to be consoled and to search for knowledge within the Epic of Gilgamesh itself, it's all just so incredible. It blows my mind. I just think it's just amazing. So that was one of the stories. There's let me read this part here. This is later on. The reliefs depicting the Elamite wars are unique among Assyrian art in their destiny or their density of literary and scholarly allusions. For all his talk of violence, these were the interests closest to Ashurbanipal's heart. End quote. And so what's happening here and what we see in other parts of the book are that these reliefs that are made that are carved in stone after major battles, they're giving the story of the battle, but there are literature allusions in these things, and there are allusions to Gilgamesh itself. So Ashurbanipal is kind of tying himself in with Gilgamesh in these reliefs. And it's kind of, I heard this past week where when illustrators are working together with poets or working together with authors, there are things that the illustrator can do that you might not find the exact description in the text, but just based on research or time period research, that kind of thing, the illustrator can include things in the illustration that are not found in the text, but that enhance the entire story by showing you things that you can't just have all of that in the text itself. So the two can work closely together. And I was just thinking about that in the sense of you've got these reliefs, and there are literary allusions in there. There's things beyond that these reliefs can show, as opposed to just showing the battle. They can show allusions to literature. They can show allusions to things that the audience would have understood. And again, just another cool thing. This is the final thing I'll share about Gilgamesh. One of the library's manuscripts of the Gilgamesh poem is labeled, and it has a declaration that it was copied and checked by Ashurbanipal himself. So here's the king copying out in cuneiform tablet part of the story of Gilgamesh, and then he signs it, so it's in his hand. But I mean, the fact that we have that, something almost 2,500 years old, that the king of Assyria himself is copying out Gilgamesh. It's just amazing. It's amazing that we have the ability to read that story, that we can understand it, and just incredible. And now the final thing in this segment is just the connection between the Old Testament and other works from ancient Mesopotamia. So here's a paragraph. I just found this to be really helpful. Although there are many similarities between the Hebrew scriptures and Babylonian texts, it is the differences that are most illuminating, as they are very often polemical, intending to show just how different the Hebrew God was from the gods that the Babylonians worshipped. The story of the Tower of Babel is a particularly good illustration of this. In the biblical tale, the people of Sumer, they are called Shinar, decide to build a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens. God becomes angry with their arrogance and mixes up their language so that they cannot understand each other. Whereas formerly there was only one language in the whole world, now there are many, and God scatters their speakers across the world. The Bible proclaims that this is why the city is called Babel, because God confused their language. This is a pun on the Hebrew word balal, which means to confuse, which explains the real meaning of the name of the city of Babylon, as the Hebrew writers would have seen it. Interpretation by pun is exactly the kind of technique that Babylonian scholars themselves used. Here, the Hebrew Bible turns it against them. End quote. I love that. You see that throughout this book, that Babylonian scribes and scholars, they would use puns in their work. And here's the Bible kind of commenting on that in the Tower of Babel story by using a pun. And that was neat. There's a whole part of this book that kind of talks about similarities and differences between Hebrew Bible and Mesopotamian texts, especially in the area of the flood, the deluge, and creation, and that sort of thing. I am a geek about these things. I love kind of learning about these, so it was fun to see those different sections of this book. So I'll close out in the next segment with the one thing that stood out the most in this work, the Library of Ancient Wisdom. The subtitle for this book is Mesopotamia and the Making of the Modern World. I've read other books that are similar. I've read How the Scots Invented the Modern World, and I love those kind of books. Just you see the influence of these different areas and how they've influenced our modern life and how we have things we just kind of take for granted. But this one was so interesting in that a lot of things that were attributed to other people, when we got access to these libraries, we saw that the Babylonians had gotten to these things well before. And so I wanted to give a few examples, and this page comes on page 159 of the book. Many other Babylonian mathematical concepts have reached us via the Greeks, especially in the realm of astronomy, while others were forgotten and had to be invented for a second time, end quote. So I love that. Had to be invented for a second time. So the Babylonians had discovered them, but then someone else did. And here's a specific example. Using a graph to understand motion or speed over time is usually credited to scholars in Oxford and Paris around AD 1350, but the Babylonians were doing it 1,500 years before, 1,500 years earlier, end quote. So here you've got a time difference of 1,500 years where the Babylonians had discovered something. And it reminds me of when I read Enheduanna, the priestess in the city of Ur, and she's kind of perhaps maybe the first named author in history, and she's this priestess who lives in the town where Abram was called out of, and she would have been 1,500 years before Homer. So you look at these vast differences in time, and that's one thing I just love about ancient Mesopotamia. You've got it's so ancient. It goes so far back. It's almost hard for us to understand that. Like, we're closer in time to when Jesus was alive than than the difference between Jesus and Enheduanna. Like, that's crazy. And that's how far these things go back. And yet here we have access to some of these documents. They may be foreign to us. They may be weird, but perhaps as we kind of dig deeper into these or read more of them, we learn more and we see some similarities. And so that's my one thing of just how far this goes back, and the Babylonians were doing it 1,500 years earlier. It's just a fun thing to think about. One other point that comes up in this book is just, so we've got Ashurbanipal's library. Again, the fire helped it preserve, and yet the achievements of the 21st century are more vulnerable than those things. I look at the files on my computer and I worry just about the file format of my photos. Like, will that be around in 5 years from now, or 2 or 10 or 20? I'm guessing there'll be something that easily transforms a JPEG into something else, but what if not? Or what if we just lose the ability to store things online anymore? What if there's some catastrophic thing and you don't have any physical forms of your photos or your files or anything, and they're just gone? Or 5,000 years from now, people are trying to decipher what we did at this time. And there's just, maybe you can't get those records because the systems they're using are so different than ours, or something like that. And you just kind of think about that. And I mean, most people are not even buying books anymore. We're just kind of buying, we're looking at things all digitally, and not that the books we're buying would last 5,000 years or something, but there's just this element of what we're doing now. It's almost more vulnerable than clay tablets of 3,500 years ago. It's just an interesting thing to think about. So in conclusion, I loved this book. It tied connection points to such places as Homer and the Bible. So you would see connections between the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and Homer, perhaps in the Iliad, or the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Bible. And I just am just fascinated by that. So I loved that aspect of this book. There's a lot of expectation with these 30,000 tablets. Many of them remain unread. What if we find the rest of the Gilgamesh story that is still missing? What if we find other just enchanting stories or things we never dreamed of? It's really fun to consider that. And then with Gilgamesh, that's how I started this Immortal Books reading project. It has a special place in my heart. So to see the library and to learn about the library where that came from, where we got so many of those tablets for this story, it was really cool to learn about that. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. If you have a comment about this episode, I would love if you could do that on Substack, just so we can kind of get a conversation going there. Other people can see it. They can comment on your comment, and we can go from there. I am in the month of July here, so the month of July is when I take a summer break. So I've been reading just like books like this that have piled up on the to-be-read pile. Next up, I have The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. That is my short great books book for this month, and the one that we're covering next week on Wednesday. If you're interested in joining to discuss that book, you just have to become a paid subscriber on Substack for Books of Titans, and I will send you the information for that Zoom call. That is a fantastic book. I have not read it in over 20 years, but I remember it vividly. I remember it reading it and just having a big impact. So I'm excited to consider it again. So I started July with The Library of Ancient Wisdom, and then I read a book called The Idea Machine. It's a book about books, and that's written by Joel J. Miller. I got an advanced copy of that one. That one's going to come out in November, but that is an incredible book. I just finished it right before recording this podcast episode. So I don't know if I'll talk about that next or if that'll be later around the time the book comes out, but I can't wait to tell you about that book because it is so good. So kind of mark your calendars for November 18th. That's when The Idea Machine by Joel J. Miller will come out. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter. I've got a ton of resources on the website to help you find books and create your own reading list. I will be back next week to discuss another book from my 2025 reading list. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.